I'll flip slides for you, Bill, but you want to sort of set the stage?
Sure. No, it sounds good. Thanks, Mark. The cat's out of the bag once again. So anyway, but hey, welcome everyone to our third deep dive on COVID-19. A lot's gone on since our last update. You know, from a personal perspective, this is a pretty important topic. You know, for me, my family and I have all had COVID. Fortunately, most of us have recovered, but my wife is still suffering with some long COVID symptoms. Additionally, and most recently, my father, who's 93, just came down with COVID. So that was rather sobering, but by God's mercy, he's not exhibiting many of the traditional symptoms. So we're very grateful for that. I can also say that COVID has significantly influenced the allocations and the way that we think about our investments for the family office. So this is really a very encompassing topic, and I'm just, you know, so pleased to have our guests with us today, two alumni and a new one. So let me go over some quick bios, and then we'll get right to it. So first of all, we're really happy to have Glenn Grossman to our panel this morning. As I mentioned previously, Glenn was recommended to us by Stephen Burke, so it's a double pleasure. And Glenn is the Senior Director of Outcomes Research at Novartis. He's an epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience involving epidemiology projects with Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Health, CDC, other pharmaceutical and commercial governmental healthcare clients. So he's really quite knowledgeable on the subject and has presented in many forums. So we're really happy to have him with us this morning. Second up will be one of our alumni from our second panel, Vishal Gulati. And as you recall, Vishal is a venture partner with Draper Esprit, investing in healthcare, genomics, synthetic biology. And Vishal is a Rhodes Scholar and former clinical virology researcher at Imperial College. Banning cleanup for us this morning will be Steve Cucciaro. And you all remember Steve. He's president and chief investment officer of 3Edge Asset Management based in Boston. Steve was previously president and CIO of Windward Investment Management, which was a $20 billion asset management firm. Of course, he comes to us as a member of the board of directors of IHME, and had a lot of data to share last time. I think collectively we've got some IHME representation in the presentations today. So we're really happy to, again, happy to have everyone. Let me go ahead and I'll hand the mic over to Glenn. And Glenn, why don't you go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, hi everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me and including me today. I'm going to keep this pretty casual. And so generally, I can describe what our history has been with COVID, general trajectories, how it's distributed in different places. And I can also answer questions about how we know what we know for some specific types of questions that you might have. So I can sometimes add value in that way. Let me just go through slides. I'm going to go at a pretty rapid pace so I can come back if there's questions later. But essentially, a lot of epidemiologists were looking at the Southern Hemisphere over our summer in the Northern Hemisphere, because that was their winter. And they had a winter of hell. And so that's what really led a lot of us to anticipate what we're seeing now in the Northern Hemisphere in terms of increased our reproductive rate values, in terms of the spread, in terms of the volume, also in terms of the severity of the disease. Typically, the dose makes the poison. And if there's a higher amount of initial dose, and so if spread is easier, then that also contributes potentially to an increase in the severity of the disease associated with the infection. In the typically the way that our flu, our respiratory illnesses tend to increase in the Northern Hemisphere during the winter time, during the period of approximately, you see here like November-ish to April or so. And so that's what we're expecting, that the COVID surge is going to be fit approximately those timelines without intervention. in the Northern Hemisphere. So here's where we look so far. Europe has some shutdowns. That's why their cases have started going down. United States, ours has been going up. This blip that we're seeing up here where it looks like it's starting to go down is probably most likely a issue with testing and a data issue rather than an underlying true issue that we're looking at. In fact, when you look at the country level, this is from the COVID tracking project, you can see that tests have gone down dramatically. It has occurred regionally, but we've seen it across the board. Particularly, if you recall, the last week has been Thanksgiving weekend, and so a lot of people have simply not been going out for tests. So the diagnosed cases has gone down a little bit. However, it has not really affected the hospitalization, because you'd imagine that people with severe illness are being hospitalized either way. And so we've now exceeded 100,000 currently hospitalized in the United States. Daily deaths is increasing as well. And you may have read the news that yesterday's number of total patients who died with COVID-19 is at least as high as any other day that we've had so far this year, and is on an increasing trend. So there are impacts regionally. One of the interesting things that we're looking at now is that previously when we saw the different surges, they happened at the different regions at different times. So the Northeast got hit really hard at the beginning of the year in that first surge. This is diagnosed cases, and we know that we're way better at diagnosing now than we were back then. So you can't really compare the volume, like the totals of the surges across time. Really, a chart like this is best interpreted as looking at week over week change. So if you look at a current amount and look at the past week or few weeks, then it's most helpful in looking at that. It's also helpful looking across regions to compare at the same period of time the relative number of cases. You see that the Midwest was doing really poorly for a while. They're still doing very poorly. They are on a slightly downward trend, but they're still not anywhere out of the woods yet. Death rates are quite high. So for instance, if you break it down, this is the cases per million people. It's a useful way of looking at all the states at the same, by adjusting for the same population sizes. And so then this is a useful way to see how hard different states are being hit. If South Dakota or some of these states were their own country, they would be among the hardest hit countries in the world right now. And so the United States is not doing well currently. When we look at hospitalization rates, so there's two typical ways of looking at this. What we're looking at now is the total hospitalization rates by state. So right now we've exceeded 100,000 patients currently hospitalized, and we still are on an upward trajectory. And so when you look at this, you can see where a lot of the hospitalized patients are sitting, and they tend to be sitting in the states that are most populous. And so you can see just generally where the hospitalizations are. But a more interesting way of looking at it is actually when you adjust it again. In this case, it's per million. And so this shows sort of capacity, because when you look at a state like Texas in the previous slide, yeah, they have a lot of COVID-19 patients in the hospitals, but they also have a lot more hospitals in general, a lot more hospital beds. So it doesn't necessarily hit them as much. When you compare this in a normalized way, you see that Texas is not doing well, but it's not doing nearly as poorly as a lot of other states that are out there. However, when you look at the United States as a whole, what one insight is that over 90% of hospitals in the U.S. are currently stretched, and across the United States, again, things are the trajectory is getting worse over time. So we are at risk of our hospitalizations really getting crushed in a lot of different areas at this point. When you look in other regions outside of the United States, Europe went under lockdown for a period. It had an enormous effect, and so their total deaths were, this is cases that we're looking at, but you can see a rapid reduction in cases across Europe. Here we're looking at Europe's total deaths. The total deaths continue to rise, but relative deaths in terms of the peaks, you can see that there's a decrease across lots of different countries there. All right, now I'm going to focus a little bit more on the United States. So this is as of today, the current COVID deaths per million. This is averaged over the last 7 days, and you can see where which states have been really hit hard. And so what I want to do is show the trajectories. This slide isn't that great. This comes from the COVID tracking project again. It doesn't really allow you to see a lot of granularity in the most recent days and weeks. So it's not a great way. but I like it because it shows how the states are performing relative to the previous surges. So for instance, in the previous surge, in the first surge, let's say, New York City, New Jersey, we're looking here at New York and New Jersey as the states that were hit really the hardest. They hit a peak of 40 deaths per million per day, or almost, not quite that amount. And you see that when you compare that to South Dakota, we're not too far off from where that was, and a bunch of states are in an upward trajectory approaching that. I put here the 8 deaths per million per day threshold, and that's interesting because this is the threshold that the IHME group uses in their threshold for some of the forecasting work that they're doing in terms of when they expect that states will shut down. What we're noticing here, so I put a few slides together. I really like it. I'm glad that we have Steve here joining us today, who's on the board of IHME. I really like these projections in contrast to some of the other projections that are out there. They tend to be very robust based on the underlying assumptions that they're using, and particularly some of the changes they've made over the last month or so. But when you compare what was predicted based on and the mortality associated, the mortality volume associated with the predicted date of shutdown, you'll notice that a lot of these states haven't shut down yet. And so that means that the fatality, the total number of deaths is going to be higher than anticipated by even a model that a depressing model like IHME had produced. So I'm just going to compare just real quickly, just go through some of these. So you see that these states were anticipated to shut down by November, and yet as of December 2nd, this is from New York Times, they keep track of all the mandates that we're looking at. There have been very few shutdowns or curfews that have been in place across the country, and they don't match with the hardest hit places. Similarly, when you look at businesses shutting down, there are an increasing number of businesses that have restrictions, but even still, when you look at where the deaths are occurring, they're not overlapping very well. And finally, the mask mandate. You see that there's a very clear number of states and some weak areas, some weak states in the country that have not put in mandatory mask restrictions. And so this is impacting, it's going to impact the fatality rate as well. One interesting slide that I like to compare is this is the IHME review based on survey data of respondents, what percentage of respondents say they use masks versus what the mandates say they should be doing. And you see that there's a lot of discrepancy there. So for instance, in Louisiana, you see that although there was a mandatory mask requirement or mask mandate at November 12th, approximately the time that this was published with IHME, you can see that level of self-reporting of mask wearing was actually substantially less than many other states. So in terms of modeling, in terms of looking at the impact, we can't look at mandates as rigorously perhaps as we would like, because the revealed behavior doesn't necessarily match as well as we'd like. Just a few more slides and then I'll hand it over. All right, so this is the IHME. I don't know if we were going to get into it. I'll look at it briefly. So basically, we were on a trajectory with reference scenario with assuming that the states were locking down when they did, that we'd exceed 400,000 and approach 500,000 by March. We're on track to where the forecast is saying now, but based on what I just showed you, that the states are not locking down, we're probably more likely on this orange curve that we're looking at. As far as I can tell, this projection did not include vaccines and the monoclonal antibody treatments and other things that we're looking at now. So that's going to influence things as well. Two more things I would like to talk about here before I move on. First is that although when we talk about deaths, we're talking about diagnosed deaths. But in addition to diagnosed deaths, there's quite a lot of excess deaths that are undiagnosed. So in fact, when you look at the CDC website for total deaths on average over the past 5 years versus what we're seeing now, there are almost 370,000 more deaths when you add them out over the course of this year since February versus what you would have expected versus the average number of deaths for those weeks in the past 5 years. And so the total number of reported deaths in the United States is approximately 250,000, but you see that we're approaching 370,000 total. What's the reason for this discrepancy? Here what I'm showing you is the raw data. You can see that the purple line was the average number over the past 5 years. The orange line was sort of the statistical reference line. in terms of this hypothesis test of whether there were excess deaths. But the more interesting line here is this purple line. The total volume under this represents the surges. And there's a lag, so the most recent data we can't trust too much. But the key issue here is that there's several reasons for why there's excess deaths that are not diagnosed as COVID. The two main reasons are misclassification, and then also there are deaths for potentially consequence to the pandemic that are not directly result of infection from COVID. So for instance, in some long-term care facilities, there's a hypothesis that some people with dementia or Alzheimer's who don't have visitation, they might have increased loneliness over time, and that contributes to a downward spiral in the disease process and might cause premature death. Additionally, people who might have heart attack symptoms might be resistant to go to the hospital because they don't want to catch SARS-CoV-2. And as a result, they don't get the treatment they need and they die at home from heart attacks. However, when you test this analysis, and this is just all provisional, we're going to know a lot more in the coming months as people investigate this more rigorously. But what you can see is the shape of the curve is most suggestive of misclassification, that there just simply weren't enough tests early on. And so over time, hospitals have been getting better at accurately diagnosing and classifying patients. So the problem is that when you look across time, we still see a lot of excess deaths in the green. And that again, this is the non-COVID diagnosis. And so part of this is that, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of states are being hit now much harder than they were earlier in the year. So they haven't learned some of these hard lessons of diagnosing correctly and whatnot. Because there's a really big diversity of symptoms that people have. And some people could throw blood clots from SARS-CoV-2 based on the distribution of ACE2 receptors, but not have many other symptoms or only have minor symptoms that might have signaled to them that they were infected. One last thing before I close this out is sometimes there's a question, well, how much of the surge is simply an artifact of increased testing? Because we know that there's false positive rates and how much of this is due to testing. So one quick analysis I did was looking at the states that were reporting the number of cases versus tests. And what you can see clearly is that the case surge and the testing surge are not occurring in the same states. So the states with the highest case surges right now have, so there's 30%, they account for 30% of the cases, but only 13% of the tests. In contrast, the states with the highest testing account for only 13% of the cases, but 34% of the tests. So there's testing surges going on and cases surges going on, and they're not the same states. So that's a pretty clear evidence that this is really not an artifact of increased testing. All right, with that, I'm going to close this out and return it to you, Bill.
Super. Thanks so much, Glenn. Some really interesting data there. We'll go ahead and move over to Vishal, and we'll pass the baton there. Then, just as a point of order, so we'll take questions at the end. We'll go through the next two presentations, and then we'll open it up. Also, feel free to put your questions into the chat as well. So definitely want to encourage the dialogue as we move forward. Go ahead, Vishal.
Thank you very much, Bill. You'll have to stop sharing this one for me to be able to share my slide. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Delighted to be on here again. Very much enjoyed the last one and looking forward to sharing some information with you. So I don't know if you can see my screen now. You should be able to.
Yes.
Excellent. So I will very quickly, what I will try and do is I will pick up from one of my slides at the last presentation just for continuity, but I'm not sharing any data from the last presentation. This time I focused my attention almost exclusively to the vaccines and to what I am imagining the future to be post-vaccine, and what questions can be answered today and what questions we can't answer today. And I'm delighted that we had an epidemiologist going through all this data. But so this is I shared this last time as the Swiss cheese model, where we will have several layers of products and interventions, which will all add up to hopefully a future in which we can reduce the transmission to very, very low numbers and maybe reduce the deaths to a very small number. And in these, last time when I spoke to you, these were all the things that were available to us as different layers of cheese. But then this time when I'm speaking to you, we've added a very important layer in this cheese, which is the vaccine. So, so there are a lot of questions around what the vaccine means, what different vaccines there are, etc. So I just wanted to run through some of the data that I've collected around that. So the first question that is asked is, so many vaccines, looks like vaccines are like buses. You wait for one for a long time, and then 3 of them come around at the same time. So this is the table of all the different vaccines that are currently either approved. So the 3 on the left, on my left, have been approved, have data, efficacy data. One of them has been approved in one country, which happens to be the country where I live, but I'm far too young and far too healthy to be one of the early recipients of this vaccine. And then there are, Moderna has filed for their EUA. AstraZeneca will file their EUA in the UK. It is not clear whether they will be filing in the US because there is a specific issue that I'll come to briefly. And there are a couple that are in pipeline. You can see that they are all using different technology. The most common technology among them is mRNA, which is an amazing achievement of science, because if you look at Nature Reviews Drug Discovery from November 2019, there's an article in that issue by none other than Dr. Tony Fauci, saying how mRNA could be a future platform for making vaccines for pandemics. And we are in November 2020, and we have efficacy data on not just 1, but 2 mRNA vaccines. This is science working at a pace we have never seen before. And I'm hoping, and I'm fairly convinced, that we are not going back to taking 10 years in developing the next vaccine. It is not going to be like that. It's going to be very different. And we'll come to that when we discuss investment opportunities of what that might mean. So this is lots of data. Some of it is there is one row in this table which is very actionable for everyone on this call. And it can be extremely useful, because you might have a question. My healthcare provider has reached out to me and said, I'm about to get my COVID vaccine, but I don't know which vaccine it is, and I want this vaccine or that vaccine. Here's a tip for you. All these vaccines have a slightly different schedule. So if your healthcare provider says, you're going to have your first vaccine today and the next one in 22 days, you know for sure you're getting the Pfizer vaccine. And if they say it's going to be 4 weeks, it's going to be 29 days, you know you're going to get the Moderna vaccine. So that's sort of a tip for everyone in case you want to know which vaccine you're getting. We're all very curious now. Everyone wants to know more. The other thing that I want to point out on this chart is this bit, which is that there is some discrepancy in the AstraZeneca University of Oxford vaccine about how successful it is. Now, this just tells us how picky we have become. In 2020, human civilization is so fickle and so picky. There was a time when we were begging, God, let there be a vaccine. We were not saying, we would be happy if it was 50% effective. In fact, that was the target which all these vaccine makers had powered their studies to be able to pick. But we got really lucky. In this case, we got nearly 70% success rate, but there is one particular dose schedule which can increase that to up to 90%. But as anyone who's ever been involved in clinical trial knows, you can't just cherry pick bunches of data and put them together and inform yourself from that. And I'm sure Glenn, this is Glenn's bread and butter, about trying to tell enthusiastic scientists that they can't just mix these populations and come up with conclusion. But so we don't know yet. There may have to be another study. The company's product will get approval on the basis of the 60 to 70% success rate that they have. And then they will probably go and collect more data, and then we will know. But on Twitter, there has been a lot of criticism about this particular thing, and people are arguing whether subgroup analysis should be done or not done. But I would have more respect for those people if they weren't the same people who were saying that hydroxychloroquine is a very useful drug based purely on no clinical trials. But anyway, that's so that's sort of the chart which tells you where we are. We have 3 very, very good vaccines. Most importantly, we have in the record time proven that mRNA is a platform that we can back and we can do something with. So now just a kind of a more global approach saying, okay, so a lot of these vaccine fundings have happened through advance purchase agreements. So countries have paid companies for vaccines that have not been approved in the hope that they will be approved and they can use this money to develop these vaccines. So you can see which countries have been really active in doing that. So you can see very well, for most of you who are in the United States, US government has bought a lot of vaccine. You guys will be okay. And then, but if you lived in Chile, maybe not so much. If you lived in Saudi Arabia, we don't know if they have bought any vaccine. But what it also shows you the discrepancy between rich and poor countries. You can see that rich countries have been able to jump ahead and buy lots and lots of vaccine. I hope it is not at the expense of vaccine availability for poor countries, but only time will tell. Another way to look at this is to see who has bought what. So if you are looking at this data from Deutsche Bank has been standardized for population. So it just tells you how many doses per person do we have for each country and of various different types. So you will see that United States and UK have actually topped up quite well. So we have about 5 to 6 doses per person if all these vaccines come out and if all of them are bought. So these are the things that we have paid to get access to, but surprisingly low for China. But I suppose they can commandeer all the production of vaccine in China for themselves. So that's a slightly different story. There was some discussion around storage of these vaccines. So one of the challenges with the mRNA vaccines is that they need to be stored at very, very low temperatures. And these are around -20 degrees, -80 degrees. These are not very low temperatures as far as research laboratories and facilities go. But if you were to distribute it across a very large population, then that could be challenging. You can keep it in a fridge essentially for several days. So you will essentially have these central sites which will be storing these vaccines at very, very low temperature and then distributing them over to closer to where the patients are. This data I thought people might find interesting. This is what global data is predicting in terms of vaccine sales. You will notice that this is not going to be a one-year phenomenon. There will be, the vaccination programs will continue for or at least a couple of years, because that's how long it might take us for us to have global coverage, which has implications about the post-vaccine future that we might want to live in. But you can also see that people are predicting that vaccines will continue to be sold, because we are now moving away from the discussion around vaccines to be how effective they are or whether we will have vaccines. And now very soon we'll be talking about the longevity of protection that these vaccines give you, because we still don't know how long this immunity will last, purely because we have not had the ability to track patients long enough. There is some data around neutralizing antibodies which people have projected in terms of decay curves of neutralizing antibodies. And it seems that it will at least be protective in terms of neutralizing antibodies for up to 18 months. So that's the kind of thing we are looking at, around 12 to 18 months of protection. And after which people will probably need to get another booster shot. So those were some of the questions that I'm able to answer today from what I have seen, but there are lots of questions which remain unanswered. And these are the questions where the focus is now shifting. So I already talked about the longevity of protection. We also haven't had much debate yet around the fact that people who receive the vaccine are protected. They are protected from a severe case of COVID. They are not protected from getting the infection. So these vaccines are not able to protect the actual infection. What they're able to do is to reduce the impact of this virus on our bodies and to probably slow down the replication of these viruses. And what we don't know is that if people who are asymptomatic after receiving a vaccine and getting infected, are they transmitting this disease? If they are, then we will have the challenge of those people being out in the community, feeling very strong and capable of protecting themselves against the virus, but may still be transmitting this virus to other people who are not yet vaccinated. And I think normally what you would do in a vaccine program like this is you would want to vaccinate people in a very short period of time. You would want to do that within days or weeks of each other. But in this particular case, because we don't have enough supply of vaccine and it's going to take us several months to have that supply, we can't do that. Because if you think of other vaccination programs, I think the world record of vaccination on a single day is about 110 million people in India. 110 million children were vaccinated for polio on the same day. And that sort of is the kind of thing you would have done if we had that opportunity. We also don't know if people who are infected after receiving a vaccine, who are protected from all the severe immediate effects, whether they will have long-term consequences. My current belief is that it is unlikely, or it is of low probability, because a lot of the long-term effects of COVID are from an extreme immune response. And if you are able to reduce the replication of the virus, you may not have a very strong immune response, so you may be protected. The other piece of data which we don't have is how much protection do people have between the first and the second. And I think one of the companies said in a press conference that there is some protection, which is not a technical term. So it basically means that it is somewhere between 0 and 90%. So I would say, the protection is non-zero. Then of course, there is the probability of escape mutants. When you have a population which is covered by vaccination, sometimes you get mutant viruses which are able to bypass the immune response against this particular virus given by this particular vaccine, and then you can have a slightly different strain of that virus becoming dominant. We don't know if this will happen. The probability seems low, but it's something that we should keep an eye open for this to happen. And then, of course, when will it end? I don't think I can answer that question. I just wish that, I hope it ends soon. So I just put together a couple of scenarios of what I think will happen over the few months to years that we have the vaccine. So I already mentioned about how our debate is going to shift from effectiveness to deployment and longevity of the immune response. The other thing which is also worth noting is that given the majority of the deaths to COVID-19 are clustered in the high age groups, and that is where most of the vaccination programs are starting. So for example, in the UK, we are starting from vaccinating people who are in care homes and who are above the age of 85. I can imagine that countries that will get rapid coverage in those higher age groups, they can see the number of deaths plummet really fast because of the acceleration effect that it would have. And then gradually the population of lower age group will get covered. So what we might then see is this kind of shifting into a different mode where you have very low levels of infection, but you see these spikes happening in clusters, as it happens in many other infectious diseases, like we used to see a lot more than we see now in polio, like the ones we have seen in TB. So those kind of spikes can happen. And I think that in that situation, what we might find is that we will start managing COVID more like we manage stroke. We educate population look for signs and symptoms. We identify these people, test them really quickly, and then give them something like an antibody treatment, and then isolate people who were around them and test them and manage them. That's kind of old-fashioned public health, old-fashioned infectious disease management. So those are sort of some of the thoughts that I had around this. In terms of my investment thesis, I don't know, Bill, should we speak about it now or should we do that during discussion?
Why don't we come back to that
Excellent.
and tackle it then? I think that would be great. Thank you. Thank you, Vishal. That was great. So now we'll hand the baton over to Steve, and he's got some data, and then by way of semi-transition, he'll have some focus on sort of, macroeconomic and investment topics. Once Steve finishes up, we can do Q&A, and I think maybe at that point we'll talk a little bit more about investment opportunities, and we absolutely want to cover both public and private markets. So Steve, the floor is yours.
Very good. And I just want to check that the screen sharing is working. Excellent, excellent. Well, what I'd like to do is, as Bill mentioned, Bill asked me if I would talk about some of the impacts of COVID, first to review the latest projections, but also talk about how COVID is impacting the global capital markets from a publicly traded market perspective. And COVID is impacting the markets in some very obvious ways, but also some not so obvious ways. So I will get into that. But before that, I just wanted to make a few comments about the COVID projections themselves. And I was hoping we have a new forecast projection coming soon. And I was hoping by chance we might have gotten that this morning, but this is the latest we have. This is consistent with the data that Glenn showed you. And this does not include any impact of vaccines. So I want to be explicit with that. First, I'd like to show our latest projection on daily US deaths per day. And what we're showing is 3 cases. Best case scenario, which is not so realistic, is what would happen if the US adopted the kind of mask wearing that we see in East Asia, which is 95% or more mask wearing by the population. That would be our outcome. And you can see it would be a more favorable outcome. Middle case shows, this is our base case projection. But as Glenn mentioned, this is assuming that when certain states get over that 8 threshold, that they would start getting more restrictive with their demands, their mandates. And so what's happening is that states aren't going according to that schedule. So we think that the actual projection is going to be somewhere between this line, which peaks at 2,500 deaths per day, which is, we're close to that now. Or worst case scenario is no mandate restrictions going forward. And there we see a terrible outcome of over 5,000 deaths per day. And let's hope we don't get to that. But even with this base case scenario, you'll see that on a cumulative basis, we're looking at 470,000 deaths through the end of February, which is quite a bit beyond where we are today. Now, one thing I should mention is that there are many groups that are forecasting the coronavirus. And we noticed 2 or 3 months ago a big departure in our forecast versus a lot of the other groups. And it has to do with the belief of seasonality. And Glenn picked up on this earlier this morning. We, unlike some groups that are modeling country by country, we're modeling 168 countries, 186 countries simultaneously in the North and Southern Hemisphere at the same time. And because of that, we've been able to determine with a very high degree of statistical confidence that the coronavirus is seasonal. And so we have been predicting this big uptick in the Northern Hemisphere during the winter months. We think that the seasonal peak will occur sometime in January. And what that means is that things will get worse before they get better. Our hope is that with the vaccines showing what we think is best case scenario, our best case in terms of expectations of vaccine and clinical trial outcomes, this is all great news. And we think with the logistical hurdles and distribution hurdles, it'll take some time to get all that distributed. But our big hope is that if we could have sufficient distribution by the end of August, which is the absolute low point of the seasonal cycle, then we'll be in great shape to avoid the next ramp up next winter. So that's really a major goal. I'd like to turn to now some of the investment implications of COVID. Again, some more obvious, some not so obvious. So the first implication is that when COVID arrived on the scene, there was a major fear of the economy not only slowing down, but causing deflation. And we've got other factors that are causing deflation as well, but the COVID just piled on. And the biggest fear that the central banks around the world have is that if we do go back into deflation, their ammunition becomes much less useful. They can only drop interest rates so low, and in a deflationary environment, they can't create negative real rates. And so they are trying desperately hard to avoid deflation. And in fact, they're trying so hard that they've had the most major intervention known to civilization that started in the March-April timeframe. And that has created what we call asset or monetary inflation. Next, people talk about MMT, modern monetary theory. We like to call it the magic money tree. When you have a government that wants to rescue the economy, but where debt is already too high and spending means piling on more debt on top of the already too high debt, the government goes to the central bank, or in the US case, the Federal Reserve, and says, please help us out here. We want to raise a lot of money, spend a lot of money in a short time. We don't want to impact the markets. The Federal Reserve Board is only too happy to help because their mandates are to lower unemployment, to raise inflation back up to its target. However, interest rates are already at zero. So what does it do? It shakes the magic money tree. It creates over $3 trillion worth of reserves in a very short period of time. This is unprecedented. Balance sheet expands. It uses those reserves that were created out of thin air to buy lots and lots of treasuries. And that is meant to help the economy. But what really happens is it helps the financial system because central banks cannot spend, they can only lend. And that means that the money directly goes into the capital markets. And only if the governments then turn that into spending programs and fiscal plans does the real economy start to grow and consumer prices start to elevate. And what we saw is some fiscal stimulus that helped offset the big drop that COVID caused when it hit in terms of rapid unemployment, et cetera, but only was a replacement and a bridge that's now running out. Meanwhile, the only stimulus that continues right now are the central banks. So that's one reason why it started with COVID, and then it translated into central bank policy, and now it's showing up in record high asset prices in the stock market and other markets. We took a close look at the stimulative impact of all this balance sheet expansion that we never saw until COVID hit. And using some of the Fed's own research papers, we built algorithms which translated an expansion of the balance sheet to an equivalent lowering of the interest rate, which you might call the shadow rate. That's what the Fed likes to call the shadow rate. And what we've determined is by looking at not just the amount of expansion of the balance sheet, but also the rate of change of the balance sheet and incorporating some decay factor, because once you raise the balance sheet, it's not a perpetual boost in stimulus. It begins to decay. But we've translated that into an equivalent such that the effective interest rate in the U.S. in the short term, or the shadow rate for the Treasury bills, is operating at about minus 1.1%. And this had a major impact on what we look at as a more proper yield curve slope, which we look at as a way that the equity markets really benefited and really drove markets worldwide. On top of this, though, because of COVID and because of this rapid government intervention, debts around the world were already too high. This is the US government debt as a percent of the economy or percent of GDP. It's absolutely exploded. And I want to point out that it is now at 130% of GDP, and that's a bit of a magic number. Only 51 times in the world over the last 2 centuries has any government reached 130%. And in 50 of those 51 times, bad things happen, either a default or rapid inflation above what was desired, or currency devaluation. And we seem to be in the early stages of at least the latter. Now, this fuel has impacted the global equity markets and certainly the US market to a great degree, pushing prices to all-time records. And the question is, do these prices make sense? So one way we like to look at that question is to look at some measures of valuation. This is just one of several we look at. But the price to sales ratio, which is a lot more stable than the price to earnings ratio, has had tremendous predictive quality, where, as you might expect, a low price to sales ratio resulted in higher than average returns in the stock market over the next 10 years, and a high price to sales ratio has resulted in lower than average returns in the stock market over the next 10 years. This chart goes back to 1990. And where we had price to sales ratio below 1 in the US, we had the subsequent 10-year returns in the US equity market in the double digits and much higher than normal. Right before the tech stock bubble burst, we had very high price to sales ratio, and at that time an all-time record at 2.3. And we had subsequently slightly negative returns in the stock market for the 10 years following. The financial crisis, we had very low price to sales ratio at the bottom of the crisis, below 1 again. And over the next 10 years, we had a fantastic decade in US stocks that outperformed everything in the world. And now we're finding ourselves back not only to where we were before the tech stock bubble burst, but even beyond. So this is, again, a new all-time record in the price to sales ratio. And if you look at the right scale, which is an inverted scale, it shows that we should expect a very low or slightly negative average return in the equity market over the next decade. It has nothing to say about what the stock market's going to do tomorrow or the next month or even the next year. Very low correlation valuation versus short-term stock market impact, but very strong correlation over the longer term. This is not true in non-US markets, however. Non-US markets are much more fairly valued. We like to point out that stock market has been tracing a very unusual pattern. And at a time when everyone is just very exuberant about the market, where animal spirits are flowing, I think it's good to take a step back and say, well, it's possible that things don't always end up so well. This is looking at the S&P 500 index, going back 3 years, and showing that we've been having higher highs and lower lows. And this is not such a common outcome. And right now we're near the high end of the range and still room to go a bit higher. And all the fuel is pointing to markets going yet higher. But it's not inconceivable that we revisit the lower end of the range, and it's not destiny that we do as well. But based on our own valuation metrics, if we do hit the low end of the range, we'd only be seeing the US market go back closer to fair value. So not out of the question. Bond market has also been impacted by COVID. And because of the enormous intervention into the markets, we have seen worldwide the lowest global interest rates that civilization has ever seen. And remind us of a period back at the beginning of World War II in the decade of the 40s. And if we think about bond investing, for the last 40 years, people have been used to bonds being a great complement in a portfolio because you get a high rate of return, you get a nice diversification from your stocks, and you get capital appreciation since bond yields have been coming down ever since September of 1981. If you go back to the early 1940s, a period much more like today, you had very low interest rates. You had very little that interest rates could continue to go down, so very little chance for capital appreciation. And you had 40 years of capital depreciation in the bond market because interest rates went up. This chart is looking at the total real return, or after inflation, of a bond investor in the 10-year Treasury bond market. And if you invested in bonds 80 years ago, over the subsequent 40 years, you would have lost half your value when compared to inflation. Over the last 40 years, you had a tremendous gain. It's hard to tell if there might be some room for a little bit more gain, but we think for bond investors that COVID might have actually created the peak in bond returns, in that the next future for bonds is not going to be nearly as kind as it was the last 40 years. And just to put that point home, because of COVID and all of the government intervention, the entire Treasury yield curve right now is below the entire curve of expected inflation. You can get that by looking at the TIPS market at different durations. So what it's saying is that bond investors are subsidizing the borrowers, in this case, the government. Finally, COVID has affected real assets like gold as well. And because of the COVID catalyzed intervention by governments, we've seen gold prices do very well this year. Now, there are a lot of factors that impact gold prices. One of them happens to be the change in real or inflation adjusted rates. And by rates, I mean long rates, 10-year rates. And what you can see is almost a perfect mirror image between the change in real rates, and that's the right scale here, where real or inflation adjusted rates are very high in the year 2000. Gold prices were very low. Gold had suffered a 20-year bear market. But as real rates began to come down, as Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Fed at that time, was worried about the recession in the early 2000s and worried about a Japanese style inflation, started to lower rates pretty dramatically. As real rates came down, gold prices responded very positively. As real rates bottomed in 2012 and started to spike, gold came down sharply. And as real rates started to resume their decline a year and a half to 2 years ago, gold started to climb sharply. And just recently, we see a little blip of real rates coming back up again. And we've just seen gold start to slip a bit. It's too early to tell if this is a momentary blip or something, but something closer to watch. But we think long-term, the antidote to continued over-indebtedness by governments, central banks being required to continue to print money, we think gold could be a better hedge than bonds for all the reasons mentioned. Now, while there are so many animal spirits, the market is doing so well, we do think there's some key risks. One is coming up soon. If Congress doesn't get together, we could have a government shutdown as early as December 11th. If government doesn't agree on fiscal stimulus, the fiscal stimulus that has already happened is running out, it's expiring. And before we get the vaccines, we're looking at a terrible winter and a big uptick in COVID. So that could be a problem. We look at geopolitical instability around the world. We look at the prospect of tax policy changes if the improbable happens in Georgia and the Democrats win both Senate seats. Herd immunity with COVID is assumed to occur when the vaccine gets widely distributed, but it might not be so simple. And as we heard earlier, we're not able to vaccinate everyone simultaneously. There might be some people that refuse to get vaccinated, and that will be bad news for others who do. So we could have trouble getting to herd immunity before the next cycle. We could argue that while everyone's expecting the economy to grow better next year, that all that growth is already priced in the market. And then finally, in addition to governments, corporations have taken on absolute high record levels of debt. And they've been able to do that because credit spreads have been very low. And credit spreads have been very low only because the Fed intervened. And for the first time in their history, they bought government bonds. And so we have to look at that as great news in the short term, but a potential ticking time bomb in the longer term. So just to summarize, we think that the stock market has so many forces propelling it up. It could continue to go higher, but we'd rather be not in overvalued markets. We'd rather look to non-US markets that are benefiting from all the stimulus, but are not nearly as overvalued as US market. We find that in Japan and emerging markets, especially in East Asia. We're very shy of the fixed income market. We think investors aren't being paid a fair risk premium for investing in fixed income, not even achieving rates of inflation. We think gold is a great long-term hedge. We're watching closely in the short term, though, if real interest rates pick up. And we think commodities, which have been in a bear market since 2000 and have suffered because of COVID, might be finding a footing here. It might be benefiting also from all of the stimulus. And that is my presentation, and I will turn it back to Bill.
Great. Steve, thanks so much. That was a great segue into talking about some of the markets. Vishal, maybe this is a good time for you to chime in a little bit on some investment thoughts from your perspective, and then we'll open it up broadly for questions. So Vishal, why don't you go ahead and take a couple of minutes to talk about that?
Sure. Thank you very much, Bill. And Steve, fantastic sort of data that you have shown. It's really, really interesting to look at the big picture. So I don't have my thoughts sort of in form of any kind of recommendation. But what I have been doing over the last few months as we've been in this lockdown type situation is watching the companies that I have already invested in pivoting into slightly different spaces to be able to be a part of this COVID response. And so some of the themes are emerging from that, but I'm also trying to starting to look at sort of the wider picture. So the first thing that I wanted to raise was around mRNA. So, 20 years, 30 years ago, people started to understand what DNA was. Then within a few months, now everyone understands, or at least knows, that there is something called mRNA. And that's actually not a bad thing. It's actually quite a good thing. That's what the general public knows. So what that sort of, and those who have been following this space recognize that there has already been a peak for RNA drugs once before, about 10 to 15 years ago, when we had drugs around siRNA and other things. Some of those drug programs have matured, and you will see a surge in some of those products coming out. And I think that the one area there that I'm finding really interesting now is cancer vaccines, many of which are based on mRNA. So this has been the best global experiment that there could ever have been for getting lots and lots of people to receive mRNA as a shot in their arm. So if you put together both the Moderna and Pfizer mRNA vaccines, almost 100,000 people around the world have received 2 shots of mRNA. So we will very quickly see the safety profile of mRNA. And we will also end up having a very large manufacturing supply of mRNA. So those sort of things can help you overcome barriers of new technology platforms in therapeutics. So for example, when you go back to antibodies, one of the big challenges with antibodies was that there wasn't the global supply of manufacturing to produce large amount of antibodies, and took us a decade to fix that. In mRNA, we might be able to do it quite fast. So I'm really looking at that space. Suddenly, vaccine companies are popular. They used to not be very popular. I'm sure other people in this call have seen vaccine companies over the last decade. And personally, in my own fund at Draper Esprit, we declined to invest in Vaxitech at least twice, if not 3 times, which is the technology behind the Oxford vaccine. But I didn't know there was going to be a pandemic. But then there you are. So I think that there is going to be newer vaccine platforms. I think that there will be nasal vaccines being tried for COVID, because we don't seem to get very high levels of IgA antibodies in the throat and the nose against the virus, and which is why we have these vaccines which actually infect people. They don't have the adverse long-term effects of it. So maybe we will see something there. The whole area of pandemic management is becoming interesting. Diagnostics, nobody used to like diagnostics. Now suddenly we will need to find better ways of quickly catching any future pandemics. We will also find ourselves in a situation where in a year's time or so, we will have to screen a lot of different people to see if they have continued immunity of the virus against the virus following their vaccination, and should they receive a booster. We don't know how to do that. That's an interesting area where I think things will develop. T-cell assays. We invested in a T-cell assay company a long time ago. We did well out of that. It was looking for T-cells, called Oxford Immunotech. It was looking for T-cells in TB. It's listed on NASDAQ now. And I think that there will be other companies like that may be looking for T-cell responses quickly and rapidly. The area of AI-based drug discovery has not really come out well in this time. A lot of companies jumped onto that early in the pandemic, hoping to accelerate drug discovery. Other than one or two interesting things, one was by Benevolent AI. They were able to identify a drug which is currently used for an autoimmune condition, which might work for COVID, which is looking good in early clinical trials. Other than that, majority AI companies doing drug discovery have really not been able to make their mark. On the other hand, if you look at AI-related diagnostic companies, they seem to have done okay. So of the two companies I mentioned, one of them is in my portfolio, Chiron, which does medical imaging and using AI identifies conditions in those scans. And their first product is mammograms, which is a large market, but it wasn't as attractive as it has become now, because all the period of time during COVID in the UK and in many other countries, we have postponed mammograms, which means we have a backlog of hundreds of thousands in some countries and millions in others of women who have not had their mammogram. We just don't have enough radiologists to now push them through as hospitals start to open up. And Chiron is now getting a lot of hospitals wanting to use their AI as a radiologist so that they can go through these backlogs. It is unanticipated outcome of COVID. So I'm looking at where else that has happened. Similarly, in space of cardiac echocardiograms, there is a company in San Francisco called Caption, and they have been able to capture that market because a lot of people with COVID have cardiac effects, and they are being able to screen them using AI. So those are some of the themes that I have seen around me. So happy to discuss more if other people have questions.
Super. Thanks so much, Vishal. That was good overview in terms of some of the stuff that's going on in the private markets. Yeah, as Mark just circulated on the chat, if people have questions on the chat, please go ahead and send them in. Otherwise, we can open up it for questions both on the virus and as well as on the investment side. In the
Andrew Carrigan just wrote.
Yeah. There we go. Okay. So Andrew's got a question on what percentage of population would need to be vaccinated to achieve an acceptable level of herd immunity? Guys, you want to?
So we have an epidemiologist among us, so I'm not going to hazard a guess. Go on, Glenn.
Yeah,
Well,
we're all here.
Glenn.
here's my thinking on this. So it's a tricky question, and there's been a bunch of debate in it. I can tell you what the debate is, and then maybe that'll give you a little bit of insight. So basically, there was this idea of whether it was homogeneous spread or heterogeneous spread. And what that basically is talking about is we know that there's some super spreading events, and some people are sort of nodes within a network. And if those people were infected first and had immunoprotection, then presumably the spikes that come out of that would not be infected consequent to that. And so you wouldn't have to infect everyone or protect everyone. All you'd have to protect are the key people, and then you'd have a dramatically lower number needed to provide herd immunity. The problem is now we know that the SARS-CoV-2 is spread a lot in super spreading events via aerosols, which means that this whole concept of a node and spikes doesn't really apply as much, because you could just be going into the supermarket and random people that are not part of your community in terms of who you typically interact with could infect you or could infect other people. And so, in fact, that's what we're seeing globally when you look at different places. So for instance, South America, there were definitely some towns where you could see that there were infection rates exceeding 80%. When you look at other areas like prisons or other closed areas, there's infection rates that exceed 80%. And so what that means is that when you're talking about herd immunity, I mean, in real world evidence, it's probably going to be at least 70, 80% that we're looking at. But it's going to vary. So for instance, here's a practical example. Say you are in an office environment and you have 50 people in this large office space. The percentage of people who have protective immunity within that space, just from randomness alone, might not be the same as the population at large in terms of what the vaccination rates look like. So you might have some outbreaks that are local that don't represent a large outbreak type of thing. And we will probably see a lot more of those over time. But at a population level, I think the jury is still out. I think that it's definitely higher than 20, 30% that people were hoping for early on, but that probably a target is closer to 60 or 70%. The key issue with the vaccines, I think going back to what was mentioned earlier, is that they've really been designed to look at symptom reduction instead of spread reduction. And the worry is that if you get a large population vaccinated, but it doesn't reduce spread in a major way, then you might actually exacerbate the spread. And so the people who are not vaccinated currently, they'll assume everything's back to normal, take off the masks, go back to living their lives, partying the way that they were, and suddenly you have increased spread. And so sort of a vaccination consequent spread. I don't think that's likely to be the case, because I think that that the viral load is decreased enough. So it's not just symptoms that we're seeing, but it is viral load that's decreasing. So I think that that's going to be a good indicator that we're probably not going to have increased spread as a result of that. But it's still one of these open questions that I'd like to follow.
Let's see. Okay, so we've got a question from Byron. Any thoughts on how the public markets might view biotech's IPOs and associated technical risk? Do you expect to see more biotech IPOs, biotech companies to be IPOing anytime or earlier than in the past?
So I can take a stab at it from what I'm seeing. I think that the momentum of IPOs will continue from the conversations I'm having and things I am looking at. I can't say whether biotechs might be IPOing earlier than they were before, but I can completely see more differentiated products coming out in the market which were not previously IPOable. So, more vaccine companies, for example, definitely will come for IPO, because it wasn't as easy to IPO a vaccine company. It was much easier to IPO an oncology company. I also think that certain areas which were considered more high risk, like cancer vaccines, you will see more IPOs. There have already been companies that with those technologies out there, but I can see there will be more.
Glenn, let me go back and ask a follow-up question to what was stated before. So we really don't necessarily need a vaccine, to get herd immunity. It's a little, as I understand, as people are infected and they begin to develop immunity, so in a sense, sort of spread, while not great, actually has a positive, longer term impact. Is that correct?
Yes, so there's two aspects of this that I find really interesting. So first, we do know that there is a protective immunity generally that derives from that. And so, for instance, convalescent plasma. So people who have previously been infected are now recovered and no longer have symptoms. They donate their plasma, which has the circulating antibodies, T cells, et cetera. That can help people to other people who are currently infected to recover quicker. And so it's been safe. It's still, the jury is still out about how effective it is relative to other things. And it doesn't seem like it's enormously helpful. But the other thing is that people who have natural immunity, they develop antibodies and immune responses to all sorts of antigens, both the surface antigens, so the proteins on the surface of the virus, but also things internal. So we typically, all the vaccines are focusing on the S protein, that the antigen on the surface. The problem is that when people who are naturally infected, there's tons of other antigens, not just the surface one, but the N antigen, the nucleocapsid and other parts of the virus. And the problem potentially is that those antibodies might be counterproductive, or other parts of the immune response might be counterproductive. And in fact, we have seen evidence globally that some people who were infected initially, maybe with mild symptoms or asymptomatic, they are infected a subsequent time, and it actually gives them an infection on steroids, where it puts them in the hospital or actually causes death. And so this is a worry that this is something that might be unique to natural immunity, versus because the vaccines are so precise, just focusing on the S protein, the S antigen, that we'd avoid that kind of thing. So definitely the preference by far is to get the vaccine as far as the current science would tell, versus natural immunity. Because the natural herd immunity, it's like I said, could end up putting some people in worse shape than if they had not been infected at all originally.
Got it. Okay. Let me ask another question as well with regard to therapeutics. And we've heard a little bit about remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, and others. How do you see that factoring into helping to mitigate at least the health impacts on the from the virus? And then maybe Steve and Vishal, you can talk about what you guys might be seeing out in the markets as far as potentials in those areas as well.
I can briefly say before I hand it over to them. So remdesivir, we thought early on would be a better candidate, but then some of the more recent evaluations make it seem like it's not as effective a drug as we had thought that it would be. However, these new drugs, the monoclonal antibodies that people have been talking about, the polyclonal antibodies, are essentially pure antibodies based on the S antigen, and they haven't been getting as much press as some of these other treatments, but they are enormously effective. The problem is the product volume is not very much, so it's very hard to get your hand on it, but it's almost a cure. Like some of these monoclonal antibodies, if you get the treatment early enough in the disease before you really start having severe symptoms, you have cure rates at 70% or above. So people who are at the highest risk for severe disease, if we can get the volume up to where it needs to be by increasing manufacturing capacity over the coming months, this could really be an amazing new approach to treatment in terms of like real cures, where not only are they cured, but they eliminate even having to go to the hospital because they get rid of the symptoms so quick. The problem with these new class of drugs, these monoclonal antibodies, is if you wait too late, once someone is hospitalized or has severe symptoms, then it's already too late and actually makes matters worse and actually makes them more likely to have severe consequences or death. So it's something that has to be hit early on. But they're really powerful drugs.
I would just say that Chris Murray, who's the president or the head of IHME, would agree totally with what Glenn said, that he said most of the academic data and the papers and the results of most of the treatments have not been satisfactory, but he was most positive on the monoclonal antibodies.
So I think I agree wholeheartedly with what Glenn and Stephen, you said. I think that antibody treatments is the way to go. What is also worth mentioning, as linked to one of the questions that has been asked, that these antibody treatments have been developed and approved in record time. And that is a major change. And I cannot imagine this genie going back in the bottle. We now have the confidence to do these trials really fast. Of course, in case of COVID, there was no shortage of trial patients. We had too many of them. But apart from that, the confidence that clinical trialists now have in terms of doing lots of trials very quickly, adaptive design of trials, all these things have been tested and tested really well under very, very severe situations. And I think that that is the major legacy, positive legacy that COVID is going to leave behind for us. The other thing to remember is that not just have these antibodies been done at such a fast speed. These are some of the first antibody treatments for infectious diseases, full stop. The first polyclonal antibody for an infectious disease was against Ebola. And the second was against COVID. And against COVID, we have two that are already approved under EUA. We have at least two others that are in development, or maybe even more. So I think that that is really, really a completely novel way of dealing with viral diseases has opened up, and I'm very, very, very pleased about that. And I also think that it will have long-term effects on the way we think about scaling manufacturing, the way we think about doing trials in parallel arms. All these things will be changed forever.
Okay. So again, to the audience, keep those questions coming in the chat, or just jump in there. We've got one from Sherry Lee. Do you believe the advancement in vaccines and therapeutics and lessons in public health policy and administration will make us materially better prepared for the next pandemic, or could we find ourselves similarly situated in another unique virus? In other words, did we learn anything from this exercise? Did we let this crisis go to waste?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that I think one thing that we have to think about, and this is, I don't know how popular this will be, as I say, I think that we will have to bring WHO back into the global pandemic management strategy, or have some kind of a global response to these things. I think that the balkanization of the response to this virus was probably one of the biggest problems we faced. We should have had a much more global approach to this virus, and that also, unfortunately, is a sign of our times. We are dividing as a world, which we were coming closer until recently. And I think that if there was one lesson that we have to learn, is that we have to work as a global community in this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with both of those things. There were a lot of lessons learned. This was unprecedented in our response. I mean, I think that we in terms of developing vaccines and treatments, we have gone at warp speed. I think in the United States, other types of management, typical public health management, has been haphazard and has been poor. And so, for instance, there were some, I think Johns Hopkins did a scorecard of how prepared countries were for pandemics that was conducted last year. And the United States was way above every other country in terms of our likelihood of being best prepared for a pandemic. And we totally blew it. So basic things that you would have expected coming out of the CDC in terms of federal government management and coordination and that kind of stuff. In the United States, we just didn't see what we would have expected to see.
There's one thing, and I would like Glenn and Stephen's comment on that, which I have said before, maybe on the last call, and to see if you agree with me. I find that in the UK, at least, all the people who are in decision-making positions in the medical community have all been trained in the time when infectious diseases was not a problem. So most of these people have not actually seen infectious diseases up close. And they were of the generation when infectious disease had started to fall, and everyone was going to focus on heart attacks and other diabetes and other conditions that were growing. So in the senior management of our healthcare system and below as well, there just aren't enough people who understand infectious disease in the same way. And I think that that has had something to do with it. Countries that have seen infectious diseases before have done really well because their system is intrinsically designed to deal with infectious diseases in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We had some level of expertise at the top, but clearly in terms of, at least in the United States, what I've been looking at, a lot of the major decision makers were basing their decisions on information that was not adequate. So for instance, there was some talk that President Trump in the United States prioritized not scaring the population, and so would prioritize having lack of transparency in terms of what facts were known as a result of that priority. But from past pandemics and past outbreaks, we know that that's not a good strategy. The population loses faith, they don't trust the decision makers, they don't trust the public health experts. And so that's something we knew going into this, and it's just a failure that we had.
Along those lines, Africa, does have a lot of infectious diseases, much more so than kind of the more developed world. This may be a question out of ignorance, but it appears as though that Africa has fared a little bit better. Don't know, you guys know. What do you think? Is there anything that we can learn, from either, an intentional or an unintentional view of the way that things have occurred in Africa? Anything to learn there?
I think there's a couple quick responses. The first thing is that we know that this disease really hits people the hardest who are oldest or who have a lot of comorbidities and diabetes, some of these other things. In Africa, there's a lot less older people. Because the life expectancy was so low, there's less people at risk of dying from the disease because they have already died of other things. And so that's one of the main reasons I think that we see less disease spread. However, even among people who are alive, there's less spread than a lot of us would have predicted. And I think one of the other things that's being investigated is this idea that maybe being infected with some of these other diseases might protect them, might provide some sort of universal protection for other diseases. And that's actually being investigated for a couple of things. I mean, I think the polio vaccine has been investigated for this. The measles mumps vaccine is being investigated. There's a couple of others. A lot of those early correlations, when we dug a little bit deeper, they seemed like that they were a little bit more resistant, that it was probably not the case. But there definitely are some clinical trials investigating whether we can repurpose some of those other vaccines to try to just stimulate this generalized response. And we should know within the next month or two, some of the clinical trials should be reading out.
Glenn, for that to be true, wouldn't you expect there'd be a high level of antibody testing that would kind of prove that thesis?
Well, see, that's an interesting idea. So based on this mechanism of action, it would not be antibody driven. So antibodies are highly precise. They're very specific to the antigen, to the protein on the surface of the bacteria, the virus. In this case, it's some generalized response. So the human body has a lot of different ways of responding to an attack. Some of the responses are antibody driven, some are T cells, some are simply more mucus production. And there's a bunch of different ways the body responds. These approaches would not be antibody driven. It's these other ways of stimulating the body that seem like they might be protective.
Okay. On that point on Africa, can I ask a question? I work for Indian Family Office, and maybe Vishal and you, Glenn, might have a sense. We always thought, well, none of us are in the medical profession, but we thought back in March, April that India might have represented the ground zero for the virus, given its population density, intergenerational living, poverty, etc. And while I think India has the second highest number of daily cases to the US, given its population size, etc., we just thought there'd be a much higher death rate, and it hasn't kind of transpired that way. Any thoughts or theories why not?
I think it's pretty similar to what I just said. When you look at the percentage of the population in India over the age of 75, it's quite a bit less than when you look at Italy or some of the other countries that were hit really hard. And that itself explains quite a lot of the variation. There is variation that's unexplained, and part of that I think would also be associated with some of these other things that we're talking about. So for instance, like having been exposed to other infections or having different vaccines that they're exposed to. There's other things that have been hypothesized, all sorts of really interesting things in the literature, but that haven't really been tested. Here's an example. There's a really, really strong correlation between statin use and reduction in severe symptoms and death from COVID-19. Statins, as you may be aware, are lipid-lowering therapy, so reduces the bad cholesterol in the body. Huge, huge correlation with reduced symptoms and reduced death. there hasn't really been any strong clinical trial, large clinical trial evaluating this. We don't know for sure. And there's could be lots of explanations. It could simply be a representation, a proxy that people who are on lipid lowering therapy with statins might just have better access to healthcare. They might just be caring about their health in general. There could be other things going on. But then there's also this hypothesis, well, maybe cholesterol in the cellular structure might be involved in the process of SARS-CoV-2 getting into the cell and replicating. There's still a lot we don't know about the virus, and there's still a lot of these hypotheses that are really intriguing. We just don't know the difference yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, kind of following along with that, Sarah has got a pretty interesting question that's a hot one right now with regard to schools. And, are we really able to make it safe enough for students and teacher staff to be there in person? And I know there's been a lot of controversy about that, surrounding that question, because as you all have noticed or noted, younger people tend to be more robust, with regard to this virus than older. So it's a good question. Your thoughts?
I can jump in quickly. So definitely there's evidence going both ways, I would say. There have been documented cases where they're with contact tracing, testing and tracing, they can determine that there were kids that were the cause of the spread to adults and to other people in their communities. And by kids, I'm talking, we need to definitely differentiate between elementary school age kids versus high school versus college. Definitely at the age of puberty, there's a proliferation of these ACE2 receptors, which the SARS-CoV-2 virus goes into, and other mechanisms. So as you get older, so college kids that at that age, it's already, they're essentially adults in terms of the amount of spread, and they are definitely contributing to spread around the country and around the world. In elementary school kids, my personal point of view, I think the jury's still out, but my personal point of view is that it's not contributing as much as we had feared originally, and that in these super spreader events, some of the major contributors to that are if people are yelling, if they're singing, if they are out of breath, if they're like sort of in a gym or something because they're breathing heavily. In a classroom, then that might make a difference. Because the instructor, the teacher is the one mostly talking, then the kids, if they're not talking as much, it's the source of the risk to the teacher is probably not high. And in fact, we have not documented a lot of teachers getting severe symptoms or going to the hospital and dying after elementary schools have been exposed. There is the converse risk that if you close the schools, the elementary schools, and have people work remotely, then there's a lot of risk to health and long-term consequences based on that. And so generally, there's still, I don't know if you would call it a consensus. I think a lot of us are leaning more towards the idea of it's better to keep the elementary schools open if you don't have a lot of community spread in the area. But once you do have community spread, then it gets a little complicated there.
One interesting fact that we found was that that not only is it true that as the age group gets younger and younger, the COVID impacts get much more mild, but the bottom is not age 0, the bottom is age 10. And that's the best age to be as far as COVID goes. And then it gets a little worse as you get younger than that. And it gets a little worse as you get older than that. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Sarah. Appreciate it. So, another question that I had, because I was exposed again by my dad the other day, I had to go in and get tested. And as I was sitting in line to waiting, for my place in the queue, I was thinking, it's like everybody here is in this line to be tested. This is a huge self-selection bias. And I've heard, some thoughts also that maybe we should be doing a lot more random testing to get a better sense of kind of where we really are with the virus. I can't think of two better guys to ask that question. So what do you think about that?
The trickier question than you think, because testing needs to be done strategically. And so the question is, why are you testing? And so, for instance, the worry is that there's a false positive rate. And even if the false positive rate is low, in communities where there's not a lot of spread going on, then the majority is going to be false positives. In an area where you have a lot of spread going on, then then maybe you might want to think, well, what's the interpretation of the test? Why bother getting tested? If you know there's a lot of spread in the community, stay home while you can and don't even bother going out if you can. If you can work remotely, then we should be doing that. I think that if you have a good contact tracing program in place, then it does make sense to do more spread, more testing that on a wider group of people. But if the contact tracing is broken down, which it has in much of the United States, then it doesn't necessarily make a lot of differences, particularly among asymptomatic people. It becomes more compelling as you start having some symptoms. But one interesting idea is that even among people with symptoms, only a fraction of those are SARS-CoV-2 mediated. So a lot of people might have a cough or a fever or headaches or some of these other symptoms, but it has nothing to do with SARS-CoV-2. And so the positive predictive value of having a symptom and then getting a test, still only a fraction of those people will end up being infected with SARS-CoV-2. So given the lack of testing available, I think that we do still need to be strategic in who gets tested and when.
Steve, and I don't want to put you on the spot. Any thoughts on that from a statistical standpoint? It's okay to say no.
More testing is better. And there is some, I think, well, I agree that when testing is limited, you want to be strategic. Best case scenario is just to have more testing available and to get a better statistical sense of the overall population. I think that is a valid thought that people self-select. So the only constraint is that when testing is a scarce resource, then you have to be more strategic. But it would be nice if testing were more widespread.
One other thing to add to that, which is an interesting idea. So now that the monoclonal antibodies have received emergency use authorization, in order to get the drug when you need it most, right at the beginning of the infection, that means that everyone who's in a high-risk category should be getting tested far more frequently, because otherwise they might get the infection and then potentially rapidly get severe symptoms, and it happens too late before they have time to take the treatment. So that would be another reason to test more in those people.
Yeah, great thought. Hey, another question, that's been circulating out there is, you have smaller countries like New Zealand who've been, pretty effective at, locking this thing down, and others. New Zealand's a pretty interesting, case because they're pretty isolated, on their own, be it's a small country. But in terms of a process or, things that we can learn, kind of going back to the general response question, what do you guys think, any lessons to be learned, there, positive or negative?
One more time, can you repeat that? I apologize.
Yeah, sorry. I'll try to synthesize it a little better. So, New Zealand seems to be somewhat of an isolated case that they've been able to reduce, the virus, pretty much down to zero. I don't know where they are right now, but obviously they were able to control things a lot. Similarly, as I understand, Sweden, didn't have the same type of response that we did. Yet for them, once again, it's a small country. It's, they're less isolated, but nonetheless, they were able to combine a very high level of social safety net and kind of, economic response, as well, as less of a lockdown than others. So it's kind of, there's some interesting differences in terms of how we respond to things, and whether or not it's all local, or can we pull out some general, ideas from that?
I'll make a quick comment and then pass it on. And that is with the data that I've seen, generally speaking, East Asia has done a much, much better job than the rest of the world. And one of the big simple factors is that their mask wearing has been in the 95% plus range. So perhaps because of past experience with pandemics, they're more, more prepared, more astute, take it more seriously. Perhaps it's cultural, where people are more apt to behave in a way that helps the whole rather than be too focused on the individual freedom and rights. There are different reasons for it, but East Asia's done very well. When you mentioned Sweden, originally it looked like Sweden figured out a way to keep their economy running and not do the hard lockdowns and still have better outcomes. But that's now looking a little bit more mixed, and perhaps their outcomes weren't as good as they had hoped, and perhaps their economy didn't do much differently than other economies near them. So that experiment is not being looked at quite as positively as it was earlier.
Yeah, and I can talk specifically to New Zealand and to Sweden. So New Zealand, they were interesting. So the woman who's in charge, I forget her name, very quickly, right at the beginning, stopped all movement in and out of the country. So people, in terms of flying in, it was locked down. And as a result, there was just no new virus coming in. When virus hit, they would very quickly lock it down. And as a result, they've been very effective. It's easy when you're an island to lock things down and prevent people from coming in and out. And so that's sort of one of the things that makes them unique. With Sweden, again, they had this early peak. I'm looking at my screen. I'm sorry, I disconnected my laptop. They had this early peak that was far, far higher than Finland, Norway, other communities in that area of the world. Over time, the total cumulative deaths is far higher. So they ended up really with a lot of excess deaths than are necessary. When you look in the last few weeks, they're rapidly rising in terms of the number of people that are dying. And so they had this idea of maybe natural herd immunity, that if they just let it go for a long term, that it would somehow protect them in the winter. That hasn't been hit. They're rapidly rising. The number of deaths are rapidly rising, so it's problematic. And so to your point, it's the number of, in terms of the impact on the economy, when you compare it to the other countries nearby, it hasn't really been a hugely different success in any way.
Got it. Okay. So another question is coming from Akshay, and he asks about, perhaps, some news that may or may not be fake with regard to vaccine distribution, that vaccines from different manufacturers might be mixed from one dose to another. And he asks, is this possible? If so, would it have an effect on efficacy? And do we anticipate significant distribution challenges in the US generally?
I can answer quickly just in terms of the way these are designed. It hasn't been investigated. So if someone starts with one vaccine dose and goes to a different one, we have no idea. Yeah. There are going to be distribution problems. Some of it's being supported by the United States government or the governments of the different municipalities. Some of it's being directed specifically by the companies themselves. It's a little bit tricky. The coordination is an issue. I think generally with the vaccines that have been approved or about to be approved under emergency use authorization, it's going to be similar to the monoclonal antibodies, where it's going to be the government is going to look at, or the federal government's going to look at what states are being hardest hit. Then they're going to apportion it based on that to the different states or and then the state is going to decide where within the state it's going to be distributed. And so it's probably going to be a mechanism like that. It's interesting because it's an interesting logistical challenge. I know that logistics, when we talk about logistics, our Department of Defense has among the best logistics staff in the world, because you need to get logistics right when you're looking at a military engagement for military preparedness. However, this idea of sort of militarizing the distribution of this might be a little bit worrisome for some people. So we have the know-how, we have the expertise in logistics, but there will be some challenges depending on how we execute.
Got it. Okay. Let's see. Other questions that are out there. Yeah, I get. Mark, do you have anything that you've been a little quiet here? Anything you want to throw in?
It's because I've got, Joe Montana playing quarterback.
Thank you.
I mentioned that I'm probably gonna. I shouldn't say anything, right, Sarah, about what we're gonna do with the 49ers, but I'll leave it at that. No, it's been great. So I mean, I'm recording this. I'm going to watch this probably 2 or 3 times. I mean, I think this is world class. And I wish I had gotten the word out more, and we will.
Yeah. Well, we certainly gave it the college try, so to speak. Vishal had to drop off. He had a call come in that he had to take. But Glenn and Steve, thank you so very much. Your contribution was huge today. I think everybody here, really treasured this, and I think we're going to get a lot of hits on the replay. So, thanks again. Stay tuned for number 4. You might get another email from me.
But I just remember number 2. I think it's gotten worse. So I hope we can reverse the trend, and maybe the vaccine helps. I would say I have a David Letterman top 10. The top of what you hear on Zoom, one is like you're on mute. You're still on mute. But the third is a vaccine's coming. Now it's a vaccine's here. So, but you don't hear mask up, right? You don't hear some of the other things as you probably should. But yeah, we'll look forward to number 4, although nonetheless.
Right. So yeah, and I believe everything's going to be available, slides, and thank you to guys for contributing those, and we'll make those available to folks. And certainly if they want to reach out to you, reach out to Mark or myself, and we'll be happy to make connections. So once again, thanks for everybody for hanging in there. This was a little bit of an extra long one, but we wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for Q&A from everyone. Again, Glenn and Steve, thank you so much, and we will look forward to it. As they say, stay safe, everyone.
My
My last comment, we have another world-class event at 4 o'clock on the future of work. We're killing it today. So if anyone wants to stick around, I have another Joe Montana. I don't know what the equivalent is, but named Simon Vine, but it'll be great.
Good stuff. Okay. Once again,
Thank you all.
You bet.
Thanks,
Take care
everyone.
all. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.